My name is Jim Balloun. You can call me Jim. I'm going to talk about, I guess, my life. I've had a number of careers, and maybe the place to start is with my great-grandparents who came to this country from Bohemia in the middle of a depression in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in around 1875 or so. They got on a boat and then came to Philadelphia, got on a railroad, and went to Arkansas, where they picked cotton for 7 years to pay for their boat ride. And then went to Iowa, bought a horse and a plow and 80 acres. And my dad was born in 1904, and 20 years later, his mother, who had a third-grade education, decided that her boys and her daughters would go to college. And they were the first kids from Tama County to go to college. It was universally opposed by all the other farmers and the priest. And the priest thought rightly that they would come away from college with fancy new ideas, and he was right. And Dad became a high school teacher of vocational agriculture and met my mom and married her, which wasn't received really well at the beginning because she was not Bohemian, she was not Catholic, and she had no land. But eventually I came along, and that seemed to heal the breach. Dad taught high school for 15 years and always wanted to go to graduate school. So in 1944, we got on a train and moved to Alaska. Went to Seattle, got on a boat. This was still wartime. And Dad was superintendent of the USDA Department of Agriculture Experiment Station, first in Fairbanks and then in the Matanuska Valley in Wasilla. I went to Palmer Elementary School. For years I thought the Palmer method of handwriting was unique to our town. And it wasn't until we moved back to Iowa in 1949 that I realized other people used it too. It was pretty hard to learn sports in Alaska because we didn't have the facilities, and we had a very short summer. And so the best I could do was baseball. And I did play baseball in high school. I went through Welch Junior High School and then high school in Ames after a short tour to Illinois and back again. Dad got his PhD in poultry nutrition with a minor in biochemistry and a minor in statistics, which I guess is pretty remarkable. He did it in 3 years, near straight A's, working as a carpenter on the side. We were living in half a Quonset hut on the Ames campus, and I had jobs all the time. In 8th grade, I raised 200 chickens from little bitty chicks to big chickens. I sold the eggs door to door, and eventually I sold the chickens. In the summers, I would work hoeing corn on the experiment plant, and my dad owned a farm that my uncle farmed, and I would go out there and I would cut what's called rogue corn out of the soybeans. Rogue corn is what grows up naturally after the field has been in corn the year before. So my machete and I would go out there and cut rogue corn. I painted barns. I worked as a janitor in the summers, worked at the Dairy King, and I really didn't know what I was going to do all the way through junior high and most of high school. Probably halfway through high school I got organized. I was always a pretty serious kid. But I started thinking about things like how big is infinity, and if God created the earth, who created God? And I got into one of these endless loops that you can't get out of, and I finally decided that you can't prove some things, and that there is a mystery of life that human beings don't understand yet, and that's okay. And that I should be willing to take risks with my life. I shouldn't be so cautious. I should not say no to things that are offered to me, like, come on, Jim, let's go swimming. No, I don't want to go. Or, come on, Jim, let's join the football team. No, I don't think so. I was doing a lot of that. And finally, as a junior in high school, I decided I better try things. So I guess the first one was president of the High Y. And I got elected. The second one was in a play. The third was that I organized the radio club of Ames High School. And then the fourth was baseball. I wasn't good at any other sport, but I just worked and worked and worked at perfecting a curveball. I had a peach basket that I nailed on a tree, and I threw baseballs at it until I could get really good. And I'm still proud of the .95 earned run average I had when I was a senior. Also, I was a terrible batter. I could not get the bat around. So I would block the ball out, and it would go out down the right field line, spinning, and it would bounce on the ground and go way outside. And by the time they got it, I was on third base. So I had more triples than anybody else simply because I was a terrible batter. That was a lot of fun to play baseball with that team. I competed for a Navy scholarship, and on the Navy scholarship, I went to Iowa State. Having grown up in Ames and Alaska, I thought, well, Iowa State's probably one of the best engineering schools in America. And I was afraid of the Ivy League. I didn't understand what went on the East Coast. I'd never been east of the Mississippi River, so it intimidated me. So I went to Iowa State. I pledged a fraternity. I wasn't a very good fraternity member because I was more, frankly, I was comfortable living at home and having Mom cook dinner for me and do the laundry. And so I probably wasn't a really good joiner. But I was politically ambitious, so I found myself drifting from electrical engineering into industrial engineering, and from engineering in general into politics. And I ran for and became a student senator, and then student body president. And I think that was a good exercise. Although once I got to be student body president, I had to figure out, so what? You know, what am I supposed to do? So I invented a project which was to improve the grading system and worked on that. And I came out of Iowa State with a pretty good record. I was in love and got married and decided to join the Civil Engineer Corps so I could stay on land. I was not a CB, which is run by the civil engineers, but I was in the Public Works Center on Guam for 2 years, and then we had a typhoon come through with 200-mile-an-hour winds, and it blew everything down. And so I was reattached to the officer in charge of construction, and my responsibility was the Air Force Base at Anderson Air Force Base. It was a strategic air command base. So I was the go-between between the Air Force and the Navy and the architect engineer for the 9 months that I remained on Guam. I knew I didn't want to practice engineering, and I didn't quite know what to do next after the Navy. I was pretty sure I didn't want to stay in the Navy. And one of the officers there gave me a book on systems analysis of weapon systems. And I thought that was pretty interesting. This was in the era of McNamara and the Whiz Kids, applying quantitative analysis to evaluation of weapon systems procurement. I read that, and I said, what else do you have? And he had a book on microeconomics. that had decision tables, decision trees, linear programming, discounted cash flow, ways to think about choosing among alternative courses of action. And I said, well, gee, that's really interesting. Where do I study that? And he said, well, there's a place called the Harvard Business School. I said, what's that? Because I'd never heard of it. And I found a guy on Guam who'd been there, and he showed me the cases and encouraged me to apply. And so I took the test up at the College of Guam, sent it off, applied at the Harvard Business School, got admitted. After I showed up in Boston, I found out there were other business schools too, but I didn't know at the time there were. And I just loved it. For 2 years, I was not interested in student politics. I was just interested in doing well in those cases. 3 cases every day, lots of reading the night before. And unlike a lot of other education, the point is not what did you learn from the case. The point is, Monday morning, what would you do? You're the guy or gal in charge. What would you do? So the whole focus changes from what can you tell me about what you learned and observed to what would you do and why. Some of these cases were 20 pages long, not unlike real life. So the skill they were trying to teach is how do you sift through lots of noise to find out what's important and what can you do to be productive moving forward, changing things. And it turned out this was just the ticket for me. And I, having been an okay student at Iowa State, I turned out to be a really good student at the Harvard Business School. And I couldn't get a job in Boston in the summer because I wasn't an electrical engineer. And those were the days when computers were important, and it was hard to get a job in the summer in Boston. But I got this nice letter from these people at McKinsey and Company. Never heard of McKinsey and Company. And so I went down to New York, interviewed them, and they were great people. And I found out from some of my professors that it was a really first-rate firm of people who were problem solvers for business. Mr. McKinsey was an accountant at the University of Chicago who wrote the early textbooks about managerial as opposed to financial accounting. Financial accounting is the accounting that says the books are clean, it's all there. Managerial accounting is here's how you can make decisions that will improve the performance of the company. Product line profitability, customer profitability, things like that. And Marvin Bauer, who was a lawyer at Jones Day in Cleveland, met him. And Marvin had both an MBA and a law degree. And he had been the secretary of workout committees for failed bonds in the Depression. And he recognized the need for this kind of talent to help businesses turn themselves around when they get in big trouble, or if they want to do better if they're a good business. But at the time, the so-called management engineers were pretty much people who worked in factory floors, warehouses. They were efficiency experts. And they weren't terribly well educated. They were working out of their experience rather than their analytic capability. And so Marvin saw an opportunity to take the technical skills of McKinsey and marry them with the professional abilities of the great law firms of the time. And what were those? Tell the truth, maintain confidences, do a better job than the situation calls for. Can you imagine? Do a better job than the situation calls for. You can't write a contract to enforce that. But what if you had a firm that you trusted to always do a better job than the situation calls for. And always place the client's interests first. Don't run up the billable hours just to do it. Have impact. Do what's good for the client, and don't pay so much attention to what's good for the firm, at least in the short term. And have faith that if you do what's right for the client, the byproduct will be that the firm will be successful. So McKinsey and Bauer got together. McKinsey became CEO of one of his clients, a Marshall Field company, caught pneumonia on a trip down to Fieldcrest in North Carolina, died. And Marvin Bauer, in his 30s, became head of the firm. Moved to New York, called the firm McKinsey and Company. Why? Because if we called it Bauer, everybody would want Bauer on the team, and he wanted a bigger firm. Very clever man, Bauer. Very selfless man. Cared deeply about the firm. Well, I met Marvin Bauer, and I met the other people, and I decided to join McKinsey, but I said I wanted to go to San Francisco. I was still, frankly, intimidated by the East Coast. I didn't understand it. People in New York don't talk the way they do in Iowa, and they particularly didn't in those days. And I'd fallen in love with San Francisco on the way to and from Guam. So we went there. Our son was born. Our daughter was born. We lived there 10 years. I became a partner fairly quickly. I did a combination of a lot of work on forest products, some work down in Silicon Valley, some work with people who made French fries. But most of it was forest products with several different companies. And just one example, I spent 9 months in Terrace, British Columbia, trying to figure out how to get logs from the forest down into the pulp mill in Prince Rupert better and cheaper. And then I would turn around on my next project. I would go help a Napa Valley winery figure out the economics of wine production and how they could change their business strategy to become more successful. And then I'd go down the peninsula and I'd work with a computer tape company to figure out what their marketing strategy ought to be and how they ought to change their product mix to recognize the value of early introduction of new products. 10 years later, my best friends in the firm had moved to Amsterdam in one case and Australia in another case. I was getting a little restless. Everything seemed to be going well. We had a next generation of leadership in the office, and I volunteered to go to Tokyo. Tokyo had been started about 4 or 5 years earlier. We really didn't quite understand how to be helpful to Japanese clients, but we knew it was a very important economy and we should be there. And we had zero revenue the first year I was there. And remember, I said, Marvin Bauer said, don't pay attention to that side of the business. Do your best and you'll be successful. But do your best at what? And with whom? And so we finally figured out that what the Japanese could learn from us was marketing strategy and business strategy, that virtually everything they had done had been profitable, but they were entering an era where it was going to be tougher for them, and some of their business would be profitable, some would not. In part, I remember when I was in Japan, and the process of denial American business went through for 10 or 15 years. It's a piece of junk. It won't make good copies. it'll fall apart in a couple of years. It must be being subsidized by the government. It's their tax structure. You know, American business had the ability, as all human beings do, to deny the reality of the Japanese Revolution for 10 or 15 years. And then we finally got it, say around the 80s or so, and put Six Sigma into GE. Michael Milken revolutionized corporate finance and caused shareholders to say, hey, your job is to improve the performance of the company. It's not to preside over what your grandfather gave you. and so people got interested. A lot of our attitude toward Japan back then is now our attitude toward China. You know, it's this huge, thriving organization that's taking advantage of us poor, weak Americans. Well, it's nonsense. You know, the Japanese were not Superman, and they've run into problems. And the Chinese are not Superman, and they're running into problems. They're just all human beings, and we can compete with them. People like to talk about the hollowing out of manufacturing in America. Well, it is true that we have about half as many people in manufacturing as we had 30 years ago, but it's also true we have more manufacturing output. It's information technology and modern methods that have created this. You know, it's why we had 40% of our workforce on the farms 100 years ago, and now we have 1 or 2%. And all that revolution happened in farming. It's happened in retail with the creation of Home Depot and Walmart. And it's happened in manufacturing. So I think it's particularly serious now because it happens faster. The pace of change is faster now than it's ever been, and it's going to continue to be fast. What is slowing it down, I think, is the regulatory complexity and the fact that a lot of our regulatory burden is now moving from the good to the perfect, and the perfect is 10 times as expensive as the good. It's all well intended, but it's like Gulliver in the land of Lilliputians. You can look at any single string and say, oh, gee, that makes sense. But by the time you cover him up with 1,000 strings, he can't move. And that's happening to our manufacturing sector. Meanwhile, it's also happening in healthcare and education. And in those two sectors, unlike manufacturing and agriculture before it, there isn't the same free market movement that forced people to change their strategies, change their productivity over time. So we don't have the same productivity improvement going on in those two very important and fast-growing sectors. And how we unlock that is going to be one of the great questions that faces America in the next 10 or 20 years. Transportation, too. You know, if I were czar tomorrow, I would put a peach pass on every vehicle in Georgia, and I would charge for the use of our roads, and that would indirectly create a market for public transportation, and I would give every poor person a voucher for transportation and let them make their own choices. And everybody would be better off. You could get from one place to another faster with reliability. There'd be bigger labor pools, and we could afford to finance improvements in transportation that we want to. If I were to put that up for a vote tomorrow morning, it would go down in flames, 99 to 1. but it's the way Stockholm has gone. It's the way Singapore has gone, and it'll eventually get here. But we need to find ways to use pricing and the free movement of people in and out of different activities to improve our productivity, and that way we can take care of ourselves, and we won't have to worry about entitlements and debt and so on. We'll grow the economy. That's my view anyway. I have great faith in the Japanese people. I just think, you know, they've been in a slump for 20 years because their politics just could not come to grips with this. The farm vote in Japan is just absolutely dominant. And no way folks were going to vote to permit the productivity improvement that was necessary. But now they're moving in that direction, and I think they'll solve the problem. After all, they solved the pollution problem. That's another thing we ought to consider about China. 40 years ago in Japan, you couldn't see across the street. It was terrible. And they cleaned it up in about 10 years. And China will do the same thing. I think it's the march of GDP per capita. We've brought 2 billion people out of poverty worldwide in the last 40 years because of productivity improvement, movement of the free market, and other things too. You know, a government of laws, education, good health care. But if people are free to improve things, it really makes a difference. Look at the resistance of the teachers union to the innovations in elementary and high school, and look at the resistance of the taxi unions to Uber, you know, and people just care about their rice bowls, and if they're organized in such a way, and dangerously, if they can influence the political processes such that the funeral managers in Louisiana can stop a monastery from making wooden coffins and selling them for $500, then you slow down productivity. In Japan, when I was there, in order to put a department store in, a Walmart type thing, you had to have the 100% agreement of all the retail stores within a 2-block area. And so, guess what? That's really hard to do because they're either going to want to charge a huge amount of money for their vote, or they're just going to want to say, no, I like it the way it is. And that's why they have twice as many people, or they did at the time, had twice as many people per capita engaged in retail and wholesale trade as we do. They're just half as productive. And some people say, well, that's great. You know, we've got tiny little streets and neighborhood shops, and that's the way it should be. We want everybody to look like Europe. Just terrible that people should be free to drive their own car to their own house. We've got to put a stop to that. Stack them one on top of another. Make them use trains. So we began to say, what is business strategy? How do you come to grips with it? And we also developed a way of working with our Japanese clients that was at the leading edge in the firm. We'd have a team of 8 or 10 young Japanese managers who were bilingual from the client, and they would be assigned full-time to work with us. And we would plan the engagement, we would plan the fact-finding and analysis, and we would make clear that while they were on that team, they were not there as a legislator. They were not there as the senator from manufacturing or the senator from marketing. They were there as a problem solver, and they were loyal to that team, and they were loyal to fact-based analysis. And that appealed to the Japanese clients. So we worked in the rubber tire industry, we worked in the copier industry, the photographic industries, we worked in banking. And by the time I left 4 years later, we had Japanese partners, and the office was successful and starting to really grow. And we had about, I think, 16 people by the time I left. And it was really ready for me to come back home. Ron Daniel, who was then the managing director, wrote me a very nice note and said, you can go back to San Francisco, you can come to New York and serve clients, you can go to Cleveland or Chicago, where we're probably going to need another office manager in a couple of years, or you can go to Atlanta, where we have 8 people. And it's a brand new office started by my partner, Ed Michaels, the year before. We'd like to have a director there. I was a director by this time. And I'd really like you to go to Atlanta, but you need to look at it and think about it. And my children were entering 6th and 8th grade. And I thought, for myself, if I were to stay in Japan longer, I would become more knowledgeable about Japan and the Japanese companies, but I wouldn't be at the leading edge of what the firm does worldwide or what America does. And so I really needed to decide either to stay in Japan and become a Japanophile permanently, or move back to the country. And I'm an American. I wanted to be back here. And I thought it would be better for my kids going into 6th and 8th grade to relocate when they could go through junior high and high school here. And I liked the social and community spirit of Atlanta. Atlanta is really almost unique in America in the community spirit people feel. That business people feel it's their obligation and their opportunity to participate in the work of the community and to know each other and to be engaged in the community. People tend to go to church here. They tend to support the Boy Scouts, community chest. There are active relationships among the universities and the business community here. And in other places I've been, there's a separation. Everybody's heard of Ivan Allen, the mayor. His father wrote a little pamphlet called Altitude and Attitude, The Secret of Atlanta. We're 1,000 feet high, so we're not a really hot and muggy southern city that the rich people want to escape in the summer. You can live here. And attitude. At the time of the Civil War, there were 25 or 30,000 people here, and this was not a wealthy city. The wealth was all in Charleston or Savannah or Mobile. So a lot of the folks who came here didn't come up from the coast. They weren't wealthy. They were Scotch-Irish, they were Jews, they were Catholics, they were people who migrated sort of down the chain of mountains, down through the Piedmont, and wound up at this tiny little railroad intersection called Atlanta. And I don't know whether it's because they came from different parts of the country or they didn't have a lot of money when they started, but they were all hardworking, ambitious people who came here to form this place, and they started Rotary and they did all kinds of stuff together. This is a very welcoming city. And I think all the southern cities are more welcoming and open to people from the north or Midwest than they used to be, but Atlanta particularly. if you move here and you're willing to pitch in and help, you're welcome. They're glad to have you here. You know, folks are folks wherever they are, but I think this is a particularly welcoming city. In some places I've been, there was too much comfort. When I started my career in San Francisco, it was not unusual for a client to order 2 martinis for lunch. And they were both for him, not for me. and then, you know, sort of waste the afternoon, maybe go play golf. And I just didn't feel comfortable going back there. I know it's different now. I know Silicon Valley has happened. But I really like Atlanta, and I liked it at the time, and it appealed to me to lead an office that was just starting, where I was clearly the senior guy, and right or wrong, people would look to me for what is this thing called McKinsey, and I had some ideas about it. So 1979, we came back to Atlanta, and we really struggled for the first 5 or 10 years. We did some good work. We developed our community reputation, but it was up and down. Then finally it all started to click. And I passed the leadership of the office on in 1994. And then some great new partners, some of whom are still there and some of whom have retired. And then in 1996, I was at the McKinsey board meeting in New York. It's snowing outside, and by this time I was, I think, 57. And the first topic on the agenda is led by a couple of 42-year-old guys. And the topic is, what are we going to do about these poor, tired, old people in their 50s? We need to help them retire with grace and dignity. And that went on for about an hour or two. And I thought a lot of what they were saying was just silly. You know, today's 55 is yesterday's 75 or 65. And not only that, but 55-year-old people are not consumed with raising babies and just getting started in their careers. They've got lots of flexibility and ambition. Not all of them, but some of them do. So I thought it was silly, but I looked around the room. Of the 16 people on the board, 2 or 3 were my age. All the rest were younger. At the time, we had a 60-year-old mandatory retirement age. I said to myself, well, these friends I've developed all these years, they're going to be gone in a couple of years. And I got back to my hotel room, and I had a message from Bob Holder. And I called him, and he was the head of the search committee that was searching for a new CEO for National Service Industries. And I had explained to Bob 6 months earlier and to Ray Riddle a year earlier that I wasn't interested. I was happy. I was doing what I wanted to do. So I called him back, and he said, "You're just the breath of fresh young energy and enthusiasm that we need to turn this company around. I'm not taking no for an answer. We've exhausted the search, and you have to take the job." So I looked at myself, you know, what am I? Am I this poor, tired old man that needs to be retired? Or am I this breath of fresh young energy? And so I thought about it, and I had a conversation with my family. And I think my children knew that if I turned this down, I would never forgive myself. That just like I thought back in junior high, when I was a junior in high school, when you get an opportunity like this, even if you're scared, you have to try it, or you'll never find out what it was like. And the regret of not having tried is much worse than the regret of having tried and failed. And believe me, I've done both. I have not tried, and I have tried and failed. And not trying is a much bigger regret. And so I did it. I don't think my wife was particularly, I know she was not enthusiastic about it. But I said I would do it. And so in, I guess it was March 1996, I went to work for National Service Industries. We had a great board, just the outstanding CEOs of Atlanta. Bernie Marcus, Home Depot, Ross Johnson, R.J. Reynolds, Jim Kennedy, Cox, John Medlin, Wachovia, Bob Holder himself, Holder Construction. Wonderful people. Herman Russell, Russell Construction. Great people. And the company at the time was about $3 billion in sales. It was a Fortune 500 company. It had had a wonderful record for 20 years and then had been flat for the last 10 years. And Erwin Zabin, the founder, a wonderful man, had built all this terrific record on the basis of find a good small business with a good general manager, pretty much leave them alone, but make sure that the finance and the legal aspects are covered. And he'd built a terrific record with that. But for the last 10 years, it had sort of drifted. And these attractive 40, 45-year-old people he had hired were now in their 60s, moving toward retirement. And the strategies that had made their businesses really successful for that 20, 25-year period of time were getting rusty. Now, when you're in your 60s and headed for retirement, you're not a real big risk taker. You're not in a mood to break a lot of china, ease out people who should be eased out, hire new folks, change things around. And so it wasn't working. And National Linen Service, Atlantic Envelope, North Brothers Insulation, Zepp Chemical, and Lithonia Lighting were the 5 companies in the company at that time. And I hopped on stage and said, I'm excited about this, and I don't know what we're going to do, but I'll tell you 3 things. I believe everything can be improved, and I still believe that. Performance is a team sport, not an individual sport, and we work for the shareholder. And everybody cheered. And then I went to work, and I realized, I realized in hindsight that it was harder than I imagined. When you work at McKinsey & Company, all you have to do is stumble outside your door and you run into 6 young people who are highly motivated, highly skilled, want to help you. And guess what? Real life is not like that. Not everybody's young. Not everybody's highly skilled. Not everybody's highly motivated. Not everybody's trustworthy. And when you go into a new organization that's a more realistic profile of all of life, you discover that over time, and you don't know who to trust. You don't know who's a good performer. You don't know who's a good performer but a bad talker, and who's a good talker but a bad performer. And it takes a little while to figure that out. But I went in with the attitude that all these businesses could be improved. I quickly realized that the insulation company couldn't and wasn't something we should work on, and we sold it that fall. And then we worked hard on all the other businesses. Finally, we realized they just didn't fit. And the linen business and the envelope business probably belonged with somebody else rather than us. And so we started selling off parts. And then we decided that we should leave the envelope business, the linen business, all of the obligations about asbestos, and zero debt and a lot of cash in National Service Industries. And we should spin off Zepp Chemical and Lithonia Lighting into a new company called Acuity Brands. And we took our chief financial officer and made him CEO of National Service Industries. And I went over with Lithonia and Zepp, and I hired a man named Vern Nagel to be chief financial officer. And then we went to work on that for 3 years, and we started in a terrible spot because we had all the debt, and we did this coincident with 9/11. So the Twin Towers came down, business sort of came to a grinding halt. Our credit line got called, so we had to develop a new credit line with somebody else. It looked like we were going to violate the covenants on our debts, and we pulled through that. And we launched a modernization of purchasing program that had the potential to save 5 or 10% of $1 billion a year purchasing budget, which has ultimately had a lot to do with our performance improvement. And Vern went to work and learned the company in the next 2 years to the point where I recommended and the board made him my successor. And so after a total of 8 years there, we now have in Atlanta an outstanding 2 companies, Zepp that just got sold, and Acuity Brands, which is the surviving lighting fixture and controls company that's now worth about 6 or 8 times what the whole company was worth when I went there, now 19 years ago. I wouldn't say I enjoyed it all as much as I enjoyed McKinsey. I loved McKinsey. I loved problem solving. But I am really glad I did it. And it's turned out to have had good impact. Well, let me add to what I said about the transition from McKinsey and Company to NSI. If you're ever asked to be a leader of an organization, I don't care if it's a small group or a company with 50,000 employees like we had, as quickly as possible, get clarity around what the purpose is, and get people focused on that purpose. And now, in some cases, that might be cost reduction. If you have a very profitable company, but it's not growing or declining, it might be growth. It might be, let's not do either for a year or 2, let's upgrade the people, or do a better quality job, but get clarity around what our purpose is. Base that clarity on your own fact-based analysis of what reality is, and then insist on it with your group, that this is our purpose, this is our objective function if you're an operations research guy. Then Give people a little slack, but pretty soon sort folks out on two dimensions. Is there will and is there skill? Think about a four-box matrix. And people generally fall into some place on that spectrum. And be realistic about that. If you have, and adapt your leadership approach to the individual based on where they are, what they need from you in that matrix. Let's imagine you have somebody who is high will, high skill, and agrees with the objective function. Agree with them on the objective and get out of their way. They don't need you to supervise them every half hour. They don't need you to bully them. They don't need anything from you really, except some resources once in a while. But agree on the objective, get out of their way because they have high will, high skill. Let's imagine you've got somebody who agrees on the objective and they have high will, but their skill is low. Figure out pretty quickly, can you teach them? Can you help them learn? If you can, put them into a learning environment or into a different job where they can cope because they're willing and they agree on the objective. If you conclude that they can't learn, then help them ease out of the group because their next year or two is valuable to them and a drag on the company. So help them get started in something they can be good at someplace else. And do it quickly. If somebody is, let's say, high skill, low will, maybe they disagree with the objective. Maybe they're 63 years old and they don't want to take any risks. Figure out what it is. Or maybe they've got family problems. High skill, low will. Sort it out. Find out what's going on. And unless they can fix the will problem, maybe you can fix it. Maybe their incentives are wrong. Maybe they're in the wrong job. Who knows? But unless you can fix it, get them out. And if you find somebody who's low will, low skill, fire them immediately. Don't let them stay in the group because they'll corrupt the rest of the group. So that would be one thing. Get clarity around the objectives, sort people out in terms of will and skill, and act accordingly. Reform the team accordingly. That sometimes means helping people. It sometimes means getting them out of there. But it's your job as a leader to do that. And I think if I were to criticize myself, I was not sufficiently demanding with my managers about what the purpose of the exercise was. I was very willing to help them. I was very willing to help them problem solve, figure out what to do, but I wasn't willing enough to look them in the eye and say, Pete, your earnings are here. Figure out a way to get them up to here within a year or two, or I've got to figure out somebody else who can. And I look forward to seeing how you solve that problem. I was more willing to say, Pete, let you and me figure out how to get earnings up. And all of a sudden, the problem is here instead of on Pete. And I think I learned that over time, but I was too accustomed to helping people at the beginning. And I think, as you see in 12 O'Clock High, a leader in a crisis situation particularly, but in a low performance situation too, needs to be crystal clear about the objectives and sort people out according to will and skill. Transparency really makes the job of a leader easy if you can be transparent. One of the problems, for example, in a professional firm is that some people are always busy, too busy, some people are always not busy enough. And the ham-handed view of that is to measure utilization or billable hours and post it on the board. That's a terrible approach. It's demeaning, it doesn't encourage people to help each other, it's commercial, and will ultimately destroy a good professional firm. When we had issues like that, what we did was to get everybody in a room and have each partner go up to a butcher board, you know, a piece of big paper, and write down on the paper, this year and next year, what am I doing for clients, for development of our practice or our technology, for leadership of the firm, and for the community. And you get a feel for how busy people are. And have them do that in front of everybody, not just with you, the leader, as sort of the center of a spider web, but with everybody else. After you get 2 or 3 of those up there and then taped up on the wall, then it becomes pretty obvious. And you can ask a few leading questions like, well, Jack, it looks like you're really overloaded over at the XYZ client, and Pete, you've got a little bit of extra capacity. I wonder if the 2 of you could work together on this thing that Jack is trying to get started over at the XYZ Corporation. Well, yeah, I guess we could. Just a little bit of a nudge like that, with the help of transparency, can do so much better than if I were to go to Pete and say, well, you really ought to get Jack involved on your client over here, because Pete could give me 1,000 reasons why Jack is probably not just perfect for that situation. And it is awkward to bring somebody new in and do all of that. But if you get transparency working for you, you can accomplish miracles, and the leader doesn't have to work as hard. I've also, all along this time, I've enjoyed being in other businesses and working on community activities. We put together a team that designed the Georgia Research Alliance 35 years ago. And that is a really successful effort now that started off trying to steal eminent scientists from other universities around the country. We now have 70 of them. And it's migrated into a stimulator of entrepreneurial activity all around the state, an encourager of the universities working together. I've been on the Georgia Port Authority, and I've been on the board of a joint venture of South Carolina and Georgia to build a new container port called the Jasper Ocean Terminal Port. I've been on that for 8 years. And Savannah is going to be the biggest port in the country. It's, by the time we put those 2 ports together, which will have enormous impact on the rest of the state and the Carolinas, too. I've worked on the Boy Scouts, I've worked on United Way, I've worked on the Woodruff Arts Center. I chaired the Woodruff Arts Center, I chaired the Commerce Club. I just seem to have a habit of getting into all kinds of stuff. And right now I chair the Real Estate Investment Trust that's managed by Invesco, and I'm on the board of Enzyme De-inking Technologies that develops an enzyme cocktail to take wood fibers and make them more useful for paper making. So you can make paper and cardboard with less fiber, stronger fiber, faster. And I'm on the board of Bright Light Systems, that is to replace these great high mast lights with plasma instead of high pressure sodium. And I've made a lot of angel investments in small companies because I said when I retired from Acuity Brands that I'd like to take about 10% of my net worth, and even if I lose it, I'd like to encourage the formation of new businesses in Atlanta. So I've done that, and then I've gone back to Iowa State and I've worked with them to endow a chair around a guy named Balaji Narasimhan, who is attempting to develop nano-encapsulated vaccines. Lots of stuff you can do with that. If you have nano-encapsulated vaccines, you don't have to refrigerate them, and you can design the capsule in such a way that it'll go to a particular place in the lung where it will do the most good, or it might even take a medicine to a pancreatic cancer, for example. And we're about 6 or 8 years away from commercialization of that, but the chair in honor of my grandmother, the person with the third grade education who made sure my dad went to college. This guy's going to get that done. It's interesting that he's an Indian. He wasn't born in this country, but he is an Indian and his wife is Indian, and now they're Americans, and they live here in Ames, Iowa, and they're contributing to the country. My children have grown up healthy. One lives in Wilmington, and her husband is in the movie business as a cameraman, and she has 2 great children. And one is my son, lives here in Atlanta, close by, and he had a typical corporate career for 20 years, and then decided to buy a small business, and he owns this small business, and they have 2 boys who are now junior and sophomore in high school and thinking about where they're going to go to college. And my wife, I've been married for 10 years, and my wife has 2 children, one in San Antonio, one in Atlanta, and they're only about 4 blocks from us too, and they have 2 little girls. So life is good. I go to Trinity Church here. I play golf with my friends, and I still keep an office downtown. I'm going to meet a guy down there this noon. So what have I learned from all this? I guess one thing I learned about moving from McKinsey to a work situation is that when you're in a professional firm, like a McKinsey, you really get good at writing, fact-finding, analysis, persuasion, leading small problem-solving teams, bringing everybody along, being a facilitator, a facilitative leader, a servant leader. I found out when I went to NSI that I probably would have been better. I probably would have gotten all that done faster if I had just made a decision and told people what we were going to do. That I tended to rely too much on my persuasive capability and my fact-based analysis, and I would have saved time and helped people relax more if I just said, here's the decision, now we're going to go in that direction. I don't mean to be a dictator, and I couldn't possibly be, it's not in my nature. But I often think about that movie 12 O'Clock High with Gregory Peck, that there are some situations where the requirements of leadership are to bring order into a situation and tell people what to do and what the expectations are, rather than to try to persuade them. And I think when I entered NSI, I was really good at persuasion. I'd been really good at McKinsey for 31 years. maybe not 31, but at least 20 or 25. And I had to learn a new set of skills. And I was pretty good by the time I left. I think Vern is much better than I am at that and has taken the company to a whole new size. But that was a lesson I learned. I think I've learned that it is good to try things, even if you think it's going to be scary, because you lead a much more interesting life. I think I've learned that it really is true. If you set out in your life to help other people and solve problems and make an impact, then you will be, chances are you will be financially successful and successful in the career sense as a byproduct. But you'll also be very satisfied and happy, because even if you don't do it perfectly, at least you'll feel that you're contributing. And people will gravitate to that, they will see that, and they'll want to help you. If you set out to say, I want to make a lot of money, I want to get promoted fast, I want to do all those exogenous signs of promotion, chances are you'll get there, but you may not end up happy, and you may not do that much good with your life. So I would say all the stuff that you tried to learn in kindergarten and in Boy Scouts and that your mother taught you, they're all good things. They're good ways to live a life. And the byproduct of that will be that you'll be successful if you're reasonably ambitious. My dad told me about every 5 minutes, Jim, get up and do something. And I would say, Dad, well, what? And he would say, well, look around. There's lots of things that need doing. And of course, he grew up on a farm. And on a farm, you never get finished. There's always a fence to be mended, or rogue corn to be cut, or a cow to be milked, pigs to be slopped. I mean, there's always something going wrong, something that needs to be fixed. And that was Dad's life. And he loved being a professor, but part of what made him good was that he had initiative. And he always was doing something, working all the time. My mom was hardworking too, but her mantra was be a good person. Just be a good boy. And I think there's truth in both of those. You know, get up and do something and be a good boy. And I don't, as I look back over this 77 years, I can imagine lots of things I might have done to have been a better boy, and lots of things I might have done better to get up and do something. But I still think, you know, even though I didn't do either one of those perfectly, I think that's good advice. I wish I had asked my parents and other adults at the time I was in high school or college about these things and heard what they had to say. And now they're dead and I can't ask them anymore. But I have to say, I try to have these conversations with my grandchildren, and they're really not interested. Or they don't know how to ask the question. I mean, we're on good terms, but they're so overwhelmed with their school activities, and they have sort of an underlying presumption that I can't possibly understand what they're dealing with, that it makes it difficult for them to ask me any questions. Maybe that'll change if I have enough lunches and dinners with them over time. But I'm continually continually impressed with the fact that my experience with my folks and uncles and aunts is now being repeated between me and my grandchildren. And maybe that's just human. I had been single for a year or two, and I met this wonderful person to whom I'm married now, and I told Mark O'Connell that I was in love and I was going to get married. And Mark said, "Come over here." And he took me over into a corner of the room. And he said, "I've made a study of love, and you better pay attention right now." And he says, "I know you, Balloun. You are impulsive, and you get up and do things. So here's what you ought to think about. First of all, is this person your friend, your best friend? And a good test of that is if you've got a secret, is this the person you want to tell it to first and see their reaction? So first question, is this person your friend? Second thing, are you proud of this person? Would you like to take this person into any environment you're going to go into and point to them and say, "That's my wife, and I'm really proud of her"? Third, do you care about this person? Are you genuinely interested in their future, how they feel, what they can do to develop their fullest potential? Do you really care about them? Fourth, chemistry. Do you have chemistry? Be sure you don't start with 4, or don't let it get out ahead of the first 3 of friendship, pride, and care. Chemistry is important, but don't let that take over the other 3. And I thought of what Mark said, and my wife fits all 4 of those. And we've had a wonderful 10-year marriage. I did also reflect on my life, and I thought about a 5th that you should add to the 4. Does that other person feel the same way about you? Because if they don't do flip-flops trying to persuade them to get into a marriage with you just because you think they could be your friend, you're proud of them, you care about them, and there's chemistry.